Electric power. It's the basis of our complex civilization. And every year we use more and more of it. The demand for electricity in Canada is doubling every 10 years. To help keep up with this tremendous growth in the demand for electricity, a site was chosen for a new power plant on the shores of Lake Huron, 120 miles northwest of Toronto. Its solid limestone base was ideal. While construction went on at the site, equipment for the station was being manufactured. The generator's 90-ton rotor was machined from a single steel alloy forging. It underwent a series of intensive tests to prove that it could withstand an operating stress of 25,000 pounds per square inch. The completed power plant produces a tremendous amount of electric power, enough for a city of 200,000 people. That in itself is not unusual. Many power plants have a similar capacity. However, this is no ordinary installation. For you see, this power station is near no waterfall, and no pile of coal stands beside it. This is Canada's first full-scale nuclear power station, Douglas Point. Douglas Point was built because most of our economic water power resources have been harnessed. And trying to answer the need with coal-burning plants would cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year in imported fuel. At Douglas Point, the source of energy is the atom. Atomic energy is now a major source of economic electricity. An atom consists of a nucleus and small satellite particles called electrons. The nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. Nuclear energy is the heat produced by splitting the nucleus of an atom. In uranium, atoms are constantly splitting spontaneously. The atomic fragments from the split atoms strike nearby atoms, and the friction creates heat. This heat is the energy we want to harness. But atoms split too seldom to produce enough energy to be useful. However, the neutrons released by the spontaneous splitting of atoms can be used to split more atoms if they are slowed down. At their normal speed, they're traveling too fast to split atoms. Heavy water is used to slow the neutrons down. The neutrons bump up against the heavy water molecules, and this moderates the neutron speed. Heavy water is an excellent moderator because it slows down the neutrons without absorbing a significant number. These slow neutrons split the nuclei of uranium atoms in their path, setting up a chain reaction of atom splitting. And so, in any pellet of uranium, atoms are splitting spontaneously and neutrons are being released. When a pellet is submerged in heavy water, the neutrons are slowed down, of course, and split atoms in nearby uranium. The fuel for Canadian reactors is natural uranium. It's made up of two kinds of atoms, U-235 and U-238. Only 0.7% of the fuel is U-235, the atom which can be split. 99.3% of the uranium consists of U-238 atoms, which don't split. Canada has more than a third of the world's known supply of uranium, and she's developed many manufacturing techniques to produce truly economic fuels for reactors. The large-scale production of heavy water is also planned for Canada. Like ordinary water, it's a combination of oxygen and hydrogen. But its hydrogen is in a heavy form called deuterium. The normal hydrogen atom has a nucleus of one proton. The deuterium atom's nucleus is made up of a proton and a neutron. Heavy water looks and tastes just like ordinary water. In fact, it exists in ordinary water. There's a deuterium atom for about every 6,000 hydrogen atoms in ordinary water. This heavy water and natural uranium form the base of the Canadian nuclear power system. That's why Atomic Energy of Canada Limited calls the system CANDU, for Canada Deuterium Uranium. It works like this. The reactor is a large tank which has horizontal tubes running through it. These are filled with fuel bundles of natural uranium. Heavy water is pumped into the tank. It slows down the neutrons to maintain a chain reaction. The heat this produces is carried away by heavy water, which is pumped through the tubes as a coolant. The hot coolant is piped to the steam generators. It is here that the heavy water turns ordinary water into steam. The steam powers a turbine which turns the electricity generator. The used steam goes to the condenser below the turbine, where it's converted back into water. This is done by cold water from the lake, which runs through a separate system in the condenser. The reactor can be shut down by emptying the heavy water into a dump tank. Nearly 600 Canadian companies supplied equipment for Douglas Point. New methods and techniques had to be devised to meet the demands of the nuclear age. The reactor's end shields, 120-ton slabs of steel, 4 feet thick and 20 feet in diameter, were machined in Montreal. 6 of these sections of steel were fabricated into a complete end shield. The reactor has one of these shields at each end. They block radiation and support the 306 fuel channels which pass through the reactor. The reactor tank was also built in Montreal. Made of stainless steel, it is only 20 feet in diameter and 17 feet long. Yet it was designed to contain 650 million watts of heat. Tubes made of zircaloy, an alloy of zirconium and tin, were inserted into the vessel. Zircaloy was used because, like heavy water, it doesn't absorb many neutrons. At the site, the reactor building had been completed and its steel dome roof sprayed with plastic insulation. And steelwork was going up for the turbine building. The entire station was designed by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited in cooperation with Ontario Hydro. A coffer dam was built out into the lake so an intake tunnel could be constructed to provide cooling water for the station. The tunnel was built 800 feet out into the lake. far enough to reach the cooler depths in summer and avoid shore ice in winter. The 60-ton reactor tank traveled by barge 800 miles through the Great Lakes from Montreal before winter closed in. The tank was unloaded at Kincardine, 15 miles from Douglas Point. When all was ready, the tank was moved into the reactor building. In the turbine building, the steam condenser was edged carefully into place below the turbine. 200,000 gallons of lake water passed through it every minute. The 150-ton turbine shaft was gently lowered into place. The reactor produces 2.5 million pounds of steam an hour to spin this turbine at 1,800 RPM. The reactor tank was raised very slowly and with great care into its final position in the vault by hydraulic jacks. And there it was suspended from hanger rods.
Are you reading my copy? Come back to me now. Are you reading me?
The entire reactor assembly, the tank, the end shields, and the coolant tubes weighs 700 tons when it's filled with fuel and heavy water. Installing the 306 coolant tubes in the reactor was a delicate job. Obviously, the hundreds of joints have to be as leak-tight as possible for efficient operation, and every joint was thoroughly tested. Helium was pumped into the tubes, while a sensitive sniffer device checked for any trace of a leak. When a chain reaction starts, the fuel becomes hot. This heat is picked up by the heavy water coolant, which is pumped at high pressure over the fuel. Steel feeder pipes carry the hot, heavy water from the reactor at a temperature of 560 degrees Fahrenheit and a pressure of 1,300 pounds per square inch. One end of each feeder pipe is clamped to an end fitting. The other end of the feeder pipe is welded to a header above the reactor. The hot, heavy water passes through these headers to the steam generators on the floor above. In the steam generators, the heavy water gives up its heat to turn ordinary water into steam. The steam is collected in drums above and then piped across to the turbine building. The reactor is suspended horizontally in a vault in the center of the reactor building. Above it are the steam generators. A separate building contains the turbine and the electricity generator with the condenser below them. One of the major developments of the CANDO system was a remote control fueling machine for the reactor. It was designed so it can refuel the reactor without interrupting its operation. The fuel for the reactor is made up of pellets of uranium dioxide packed in thin-walled zircaloy tubes. "19 of these tubes make a bundle, a convenient shape for loading into the reactor. A fuel bundle contains 33 pounds of uranium and produces as much energy as 450 tons of coal. Fully loaded, the reactor holds about 60 tons of uranium dioxide, 3,672 fuel bundles. This fuel stays in the reactor 2 to 3 years before being replaced. On the steam generator floor, the 10 main coolant pumps were tested and installed. These are the pumps that drive the heavy water coolant over the hot uranium fuel. In a small inspection bay, used fuel bundles are examined before being transferred to another bay for permanent storage. The spent fuel, which is radioactive, is stored in this stainless steel-lined bay, which is flooded with ordinary water, a good shielding material. The bay is large enough to hold all the fuel the station will ever use. During its stay in the reactor, some of the uranium is converted into plutonium, another fissionable material. Part of this plutonium is burned up in the reactor, but some remains in the used fuel. This plutonium can be extracted from the spent fuel and used to power Douglas Point and other reactors. The power station's control system is highly automated. Most of the controls are located in the central control room, so the station can be run by a small group of operators. Douglas Point's equipment includes a digital computer, the first to be used in the control of a Canadian generating station. The computer monitors the temperature of the coolant in each of the fuel channels and adjusts heat production evenly throughout the reactor. A typical day's supply of fresh fuel is 5 or 6 fuel bundles. The fuel bundles are dusted off with compressed air before they're used. These 2 fuel bundles are the equivalent of 900 tons of coal. The fresh fuel bundles are automatically raised to the level of a transfer machine in the reactor vault wall. This machine loads one of the fueling machines. In the control room, the operator sets up a sequence for the fueling machine to follow. When the reactor is in operation, no one can enter the vault because of the radiation there. The operator watches the machines through a television monitor in the control room on the floor above. A direct view of the operation is provided by a double window filled with oil. The first step is for the machine to collect the fresh fuel from the delivery port in the reactor vault wall. The machine has received the 2 bundles of fresh fuel and now moves toward the face of the reactor. The 2 fueling machines are in the reactor vault at each end of the reactor. The machines work together. One inserts fresh fuel and the other receives used fuel. The machines lock onto the tube that is to be refueled. The end plugs are removed. The magazine rotates to bring fresh fuel into position. A ram pushes the fuel into the reactor tube. As the new fuel enters the tube, it ejects the used fuel into the fueling machine at the opposite end. Information from 550 sensing points throughout the station is monitored by the computer and recorded in the control room. As the huge turbine spins, 200,000 kilowatts surge out into the Ontario hydro system. The skills of scientists and engineers have harnessed the enormous energy of the atom. And this is only the beginning. The success of Douglas Point has shown the way for the large-scale production of economic electric power from nuclear stations.